Welcome. I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. I have said for a while that I think that the mainstream media's influence over Americans has come to an end. I think that where the American people get their news from and who they trust to deliver the news to them is no longer in the hands of the propaganda media. And I think that the election of Donald Trump, there's no better proof than his election to show you that this is the case. In fact, from an article from the Daily Wire says this, it says Americans' trust in the legacy media reached an all-time low in 2024, with only 31% of the public saying they have a great deal or even a fair amount of trust in the biggest outlets that bring us our news. Among independent voters, only 27% feel confident that media provide accurate coverage without bias. In fact, according to Gallup, the media is the least trusted of 10 civic and political institutions behind even Congress, the group previously at the bottom of the barrel. Predictably, another year of controversies, reactions, and fiascos contributed to a massive contraction in the industry over the last 12 months, despite the fact that it was an election year, a time when news revenues typically increase. Just before the start of 2024, outlets like Axios, the Washington Post, and NPR saw substantial layoffs. In January, the Los Angeles Times cut more than 20% of its newsroom, and Time Magazine cut 15%. The bad news continued throughout the year, and the Associated Press announced it would be trimming its staff by 8% in November. And after CNN cut 100 people in the summer, it closed the year with reports that more layoffs were imminent. Meanwhile, Comcast is spinning MSNBC off into a separate company that may include a news name and rebrand for the network. Those last two developments are particularly unsurprising given post-election cable news ratings. According to the Nielsen data, MSNBC is still down more than half of what it was averaging up to election night. And CNN is down by slightly less than half, though it didn't have as far to fall, given it was already at the bottom of the pack. Only Fox News, which now draws 72% of primetime cable news watchers, is thriving. If there is one theme of the current media landscape, it's that the legacy outlets may not be dead yet, but their influence is quickly being replaced by popular podcasts and new media. A review of legacy media records for 2024 shows that no one but themselves are to blame. While it would take a book to cover all of the shoddy journalism and overt Democratic propaganda that led to this point, here are some of the worst examples. Like, for instance, blaming Trump for the attempt on his own life. Perhaps the most egregious media fail of the year was this callous coverage of the July 13th attempt on Donald Trump's life at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. That very same night, ABC's George Stephanopoulos and Martha Raddatz opined of the shooting that, quote, President Trump and his supporters have contributed to this violent rhetoric, unquote. The Atlantic analysis was even more abhorrent. Only one day later, essayist David Frum, he summarized events by saying, quote, now the bloodshed Trump has done so much to incite against others has touched him as well, unquote. Well, Frum offered exactly 0 examples of how Trump's campaign messaging incited bloodshed. And in September, when there was a second attempt on Trump's life at the golf course, mainstream media continued to blame him, or blame the victim, him as the victim. Remember, Trump was the first Republican candidate to win the popular vote in 20 years. Consider how this type of rhetoric must have struck at least half the country. Even many who didn't vote for Trump likely found this kind of commentary troubling and off-putting. Well, how about another example? Insisting Biden was mentally fit and then immediately reversing course after the debate. The media's insistence throughout the spring and much of the summer that President Joe Biden was not suffering from any mental infirmity represented not only obvious deception, but systemic failure. In June, when MSNBC host Nicole Wallace blamed the Biden appearances that were alarming the public on selectively editing clips, it was obvious she was covering for the campaign. Her colleague, Joe Scarborough, even declared, quote, "This version of Biden, intellectually and analytically, is the best Biden ever. Not a close second, and I've known him for years. The Brzezinskis have known him for 50 years. If it weren't the truth, I wouldn't say it," unquote. But it wasn't the truth. And the fact that Scarborough claimed that it was helps explain why once loyal viewers have been abandoning the Morning Joe in droves. But to be fair to MSNBC, the list of legacy outlets that dismiss videos of Biden appeared lost and confused is a long one. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the AP, NBC, they all dutifully performed false fact checks and labeled the videos cheap fakes, meaning misleading edits of real video. When White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre leaned into that narrative during the White House press briefings, many Americans viewed it as a collective effort between the media and the Biden administration, which of course it was. And when Biden's disastrous debate performance at the end of June made it impossible to deny his mental state, media coverage changed immediately, of course. Many outlets began calling for him to step aside right then and there. But how about the bias debate moderations? Bad fact checks weren't just for reporting in 2024. They were also prominent features of the presidential vice presidential debates. At the ABC debate between Trump and Harris, moderators David Murr and Lindsay David fact-checked Trump numerous times, including when he was generally correct. And by the same token, ABC never fact-checked Harris, even though she made a number of false claims, like saying that there was no members of the U.S. military on active duty in combat zones or anywhere around the world, when in fact there were 3,000. After the debate, Time magazine wrote that Trump's claim that Harris supported funding sex changes for illegal immigrants was false. It wasn't, and Time later had to issue a correction. That glaring bias reoccurred with NBC and the vice presidential debate. Moderator Margaret Brennan interrupted Senator J.D. Vance as he was referencing how the town of Springfield, Ohio, has been overrun by Haitian immigrants. It's hardly surprising that many viewers were irate over the bias in those exchanges. But how about covering for Harris? I mean, there's a big one. The media's favorable treatment for Harris was no more ethical. MSNBC host Alan Sharpton did not disclose that the Harris campaign made a $500,000 donation to his nonprofit right before he conducted a softball interview with the candidate. Meanwhile, 60 Minutes was caught having edited their interview with Harris and, and to make what were some pretty meandering, confusing answers from the vice president more comprehensible. CBS then ignored widespread calls, including from the FCC commissioner, to release the full transcript of the interview. They just never did. But how about foreign coverage foibles? Not all the egg on the legacy media's face in 2024 centered on the election. When it came to the war in Gaza, major outlets beclowned themselves when it was revealed that they'd been using inaccurate statistics provided by Hamas, which has, of course, has long been designated as a terrorist group by the State Department. Outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Guardian, CNN, BBC, Reuters, and AP took data from the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is controlled by Hamas. And they did that at face value and passed it along to their audiences. The fatality numbers many outlets reported for Palestinian women and children, for instance, were found by a later study to be mathematically impossible, meaning, in essence, they aided Hamas's PR campaign. The same credibility when it comes to war coverage led to an embarrassing incident for CNN on December 11th. The network aired a segment from foreign correspondent Clarissa Ward, in which she encountered a man in a empty Syrian prison. And the man tells Ward that he has been detained by the Assad regime for months. And, he goes into this whole thing of, I'm so glad, I haven't seen the sun on my face in forever and all this kind of stuff. Well, within days of that interview, a Syrian fact-checking site revealed that the man was really a former intelligence officer for the Assad government, leading many to question, why did CNN even put it on the air or not do their due diligence on it? But how about mea culpas, few and forced? While one might expect the rash of layoffs and downsizing to result in a serious introspection throughout the industry, only a few examples have emerged so far, and they're mostly coming from owners. Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, promised in an op-ed titled "The Hard Truth: Americans Don't Trust the News Media," that his paper will strive for more balanced coverage going forward. Patrick Soon-Shiong, owner of the Los Angeles Times, has promised the same. Some acknowledgments of failure have come at the behest of legal departments, like when Sunny Hostin, right, when she had to and she was forced legally to make a disclaimer regarding the comments that she made about Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and a sexual assault accusation. Of course, they were baseless, and no forced correction, however, has been as expensive as the ABC one, where they were forced to pay Trump millions of dollars, $15 million, in fact, plus the legal fees to settle, because he was saying that he raped. They said he raped. He was convicted of rape by George Stephanopoulos. Of course, that wasn't true. Well, will the media learn? Well, maybe only time will tell. But I really like the piece that came out from Christine Rosen. She writes for AEI, and she wrote a commentary. Actually, it was back in November after the election, back November 15th of last year. And she said this. She says, failed presidential campaigns often prompt autopsies. In the case of Kamala Harris's 2024 campaign, however, the candidate's Oval Office ambitions were not the only thing that expired on November 5th. So, too, did the long-standing role mainstream news media play in the political reporting? Since Donald Trump first won the presidency in 2016, and even more insistently since his loss in 2020 and the events of January 6th of 2021, the media have made it their foremost duty to detail every one of Trump's real and perceived sins. They view him as a unique threat and see themselves as democracy's protector, even though they began this crusade by compromising whatever moral standing that they had enjoyed, namely with their assertion that Trump was an agent of Russia. Later, when Trump ran for re-election against Joe Biden, media outlets and social media platforms were happy to aid the Democratic candidate by censoring and suppressing the contents of compromised material on a laptop owned by Biden's son, Hunter, claiming falsely that the machine and or its contents had somehow been manufactured by Russia. Once Trump lost to Biden, the press eagerly and with partisan zeal cheerleaded the lawfare waged by the Biden administration on other Democrats against Trump, which led to the FBI raid of his home in Florida, years of legal proceedings, and eventually a felony conviction in New York at the hands of a highly partisan district attorney. At the same time, this industry, which boasts that it exists to hold the powerful to account, was either ignoring or putting a positive spin on the failings of President Biden and his administration. The disastrous withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan was sent down the memory hole a mere week after it happened. Persistent inflation and slow job growth were excused away as transitionatory or really not that bad. All things considered, the unsecured southern border received a tiny fraction of the coverage that was allotted to Trump's controversies. Exclusive executive orders that eliminated protections for women and girls in sports by allowing men to compete on women's teams were either outright celebrated or dismissed as a matter affecting a tiny number of people. And most remarkable, the clear physical and cognitive decline of the commander-in-chief was a topic seemingly deemed too unpleasant to cover. This last failure was perhaps the media's most glaring sin of omission, because even the strenuous efforts of the administration to keep Biden from public view and to control his appearances, which included giving Biden cue cards with pictures of reporters and scripted answers to their pre-screened questions on rare occasions that he did make himself available to a compliant press. The American people could see that Biden was not up to the job of running the country. Americans who questioned why Biden spent an unusual large amount of time relaxing at the beach, at his beach house in Delaware, or who posted images on social media of the president stumbling or appearing confused, were said to have been gulled into pushing a right-wing conspiracy theory or distributing cheap fakes and spreading disinformation. When Biden announced he would run for re-election in 2024, media figures fell in line. They parroted White House claims, including many made by Vice President Kamala Harris, that Biden was hale, hearty, and ready to take on Trump again. It's not clear how many were willingly gaslighting themselves or were deliberately misleading the public about the president's condition. But it is fair to say that many clearly believed that with Trump running again, the stakes were too high, and that even an aged and cognitively diminished Democrat was more appealing than a repeat performance in the Oval Office by the Donald. Then, in late June, the first presidential debate occurred, and Biden's decline could no longer be hidden or explained away. A genuinely adversarial press would have questioned its own behavior in failing to report on this fact and would have fully and fairly investigated the murky process whereby Biden was then forced off the ticket and replaced by Kamala Harris, who had never received a single vote from a Democratic primary voter. Instead, the media chose to launch the most unidirectional effort to destroy a single political candidate in the modern era that the modern era has ever seen, while propping up the lackluster performance of Harris by slavishly celebrating her campaign's messaging of joy and brat summer and the many other slogans that never seemed to land with voters. There was no campaign by top media figures to demand that Harris engage in tough interviews. Instead, the press repeated her campaign claims uncritically. The media-enabled vibes election quickly devolved into one, well, premeditated by the smug assurance, perhaps best captured by the campaign's sign seen in the upper income blue areas of the country where members of the media elite live and work. The Waltz, Harris, obviously, type areas. As for voters who might not find Harris's candidacy obvious, the media hammered home the message that a vote for Trump was a vote for fascism. And by definition, any low information voters, also called garbage by President Biden, by the way, who disagreed were complicit in its rise. It didn't work. Harris lost, and lost decisively. In fact, the extreme hyperbole and over-the-top displays of partisan bias by the media during the election cycle might have helped Trump get elected. This might be the first national election in which media biases proved fatal, not for its intended target, but rather for the media themselves and their preferred political party, the Democrats. Unable to identify their own liabilities, they suffocated inside their own partisan bubble. In this election, alternative media, both independent and conservative, and social media platforms, particularly X and things like that, consistently and effectively surfaced the stories mainstream outlets refused to cover or covered only with extreme biases. They reminded voters who get a significant portion of their news from social media of the Biden-Harris administration's dismal record and candidate Harris's unwillingness to answer basic questions about what she planned to do as president. On certain key issues, such as gender transitions for children, the persistence of these stories eventually required even the mainstream media to respond with accounts of their own, many of which ended up confirming the reporting of these smaller outlets, of course. Republicans proved in 2024 they can win against a media that was not merely biased, but fully weaponized against one candidate and one party. That in itself was not new. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were the subjects of vicious press treatment in their day and won colossal landslides. But this year did feature something new, thanks to the many people, not all Republicans, who acted on the insult masquerading as advice often hurled at critics of mainstream media reporting, like, quote, "If you don't like our media, go build your own." Well, they did. Substacks like the Free Press, websites like the Washington Free Beacon, podcasters like Joe Rogan and Leo Vaughn, YouTuber stars like the Nelk Boys, and even entertainment leaders like Dana White of Ultimate Fighting Championship amplified stories that the mainstream media ignored. They provided largely popular platforms where Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance could engage directly with voters. These stories and appearances were shared widely on X, whose owner, Elon Musk, a Trump supporter, of course, vowed to make a a place that no longer censored information inconvenient to one political party or another. The social media accounts with large followings repeatedly shared Biden's gaffes and Harris's meandering and nonsensical answers to straightforward questions. And any video clip of VP nominee Tim Walz cartwheeling around the stage was itself an antic form of social service, filling the deliberate void, filling the deliberate void created by mainstream media. As Musk posted to his followers on X after Trump won, in a play on the line, "I am your captain now," from the Tom Hanks movie Captain Phillips, quote, "You are the media now," unquote. In this sense, Republican voters can now largely circumvent mainstream media outlets in seeking out political news. This also means conservatives will be less persuasive in the future if they attempt to argue that media bias is largely to blame for their candidates' failures. But to be sure, a less partisan media environment likely would have eroded Harrison's support even more, exposing her unpopular views and the success of alternative media in this election. In this election, applies only to political news. Outside political journalism, the mainstream media's eagerness and resentlessness in pursuing misleading narratives in the face of fact, as outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post have done post October 7 in their reporting of Israel and its enemies, continue to have a negative impact on the public's ability to understand what is going on in the Middle East. The broader cultural environment also remains heavily biased against conservative views and voters. With few exceptions, Hollywood, academia, and much of Silicon Valley are still overwhelmingly Democratic and progressive. Nevertheless, this is a small but significant victory upon which alternative media should build by cultivating even more tough-minded reporting like that by the scrappy cadre of journalists at the Washington Free Beacon, which broke many significant stories this election cycle, and the reporters at the Free Press, whose coverage of the cultural issues has been stellar. As well, it's important for elected officials on the right to cultivate media skills like those deployed to remarkable effect by J.D. Vance in his election cycle. His willingness to explain his views in thoughtful detail again and again in hostile media environments, and the stunned confusion on the face of Kamala Harris the few times that a reporter she assumed was friendly asked her a mildly pointed question were emblematic of the strengths and weaknesses of both campaigns. As for the mainstream media, judging by their behavior in the immediate aftermath of Trump's victory, they have learned little. One New York Times headline read, "America hires a strongman," followed by the subtitle, "This was a conquering of the nation, not by force, but with a permission slip. Now America stands on the precipice of a authoritarian style of government never before seen in its 248-year history," unquote. That these pieces of display type could be written after 2020 and 2021, years when state governments across the country literally locked the doors to churches and schools and arrested people for going to the beach, while the official government rewrote eviction law without congressional oversight, is stunning. The peddling of the analogy to dictatorships past was everywhere. David Haskell, editor-in-chief of the New York Magazine, issued a letter to subscribers that began, quote, "A frightening world to wake up to, and a morning swirling with disappointment, fear, anger, alienation." And he assured readers, since he is apparently clairvoyant, that when it comes to Trump, quote, "We will not shy away from covering the the havoc, damage, and cruelty he will surely cause, unquote. Cable news hosts heaped recriminations and blame on Hispanic and black male voters for their support of misogyny and racism in voting for Trump. They refused to acknowledge that Trump's victory was delivered by a new working class, that a coalition of voters, many of whom had defected from the Democratic Party. Others like ProPublica Jesse Isingler seemed eager to once again don the mantle of the would-be journalistic martyr in the new Trump era, telling his staff, quote, "We may be harassed, we may be sued, we may be threatened with violence, we may be ignored. Are we just sunshine journalists, or are we ready?" Right. Well, given their years-long collective, compliance in allowing the Biden White House to pre-screen their questions, refuse them entry to the newsworthy events, and clean up the doctor even official White House transcripts to make the president appear cognizant, as well as their collective cover-up of Biden's cognitive decline, the only honest label for them is sundown journalists. The Washington Post is a post-election editorial chided Democrats for the party's extensive cover-up of Biden's health, but refused to hold itself accountable for contributing to that same cover-up. Well, the few among the mainstream media who have paused to reflect have had a dawning realization about the public's lack of trust on them. As CNN's Brian Stelter reported in a reliable source newsletter, there is, quote, an undercurrent of doubt and disillusionment in group texts and private conversations among many journalists. And he described a radio journalist who told him with some bafflement that he spent years reporting aggressively on election denialism and the fallout from January 6th attack, only to realize that many voters evidently didn't care. And it's true. Or, as an anonymous TV executive told New York Magazine, if half the country has decided that Trump is qualified to be president, that means they're not reading any of this media. And we've lost this audience completely. A Trump victory means mainstream media is dead in its current form. Alas, this reflection is unlikely to prompt meaningful reform by the mainstream media itself, but as an epitaph on the political journalism of the recent past, it is an indisputable truth. And I really liked that. I think that you are seeing the implosion of media at this point. I think that the mainstream media has put itself in a position where the majority of people just do not get their news from them anymore, and their influence is gone. And it's their own fault. They are the ones that have shot themselves in the foot. And so you're going to see the rise of podcasts, like this one and others, and other type of media be where people get the truth and people get their news from. And they no longer go to these biased outlets that claim to be unbiased. And I don't know, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on it. Of course, you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com. Thank you very much for listening. This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.